Hello everyone. This presentation is about national interests and foreign policy. We're trying to find out what's the connection between these two variables. How does national interest connect with foreign policy? What are the various issues surrounding foreign policy, national interest? And as much as we can find, from these two very important subject matters. So that's what this presentation is about, and I hope that by the time we're done, you're able to understand better what foreign policy is, what national interest is, and what are the various ways by which foreign policy is pursued and achieved. Now, like I said, foreign policy and national interest are very, very uniquely linked together. So much so that one almost doesn't exist without the other. Even though they are not synonyms, they're in no way synonyms. They're entirely different subject, different issues. But they're so linked that they mutually depend on one another. In fact, they are interdependent variables. So much so that foreign policy has to pursue something. Foreign policy is intended as a strategy to achieve an interest, and that's where national interest comes in. And national interest, on the other hand, is useless if there's no policy that is intended to achieve, such interest. So, national interest, foreign policy are two concepts that enjoy some kind of very, very mutual, very, very significant relationship or connection between the two of them. But the question, as we begin this presentation or this conversation, is: does foreign policy only apply, or is foreign policy exclusive to state actors alone? Can non-state actors have foreign policy? I want you to think about your response to this question as we continue this conversation. Do you think foreign policy is an exclusive prerogative of state actors alone? Now, foreign policy, of course, I'm sure you must have an idea from reading several documents, materials, or literature on this subject. But foreign policy essentially is national interest, and the means that have been chosen to achieve this interest. Foreign policy is national interests that have been articulated, that have been agreed upon, that have been decided, and what methods, what instruments have been chosen to achieve this interest. So essentially, foreign policy are strategies, methods, techniques that are used or employed in pursuit of national interests. Remember that we said foreign policy is the articulation of interests. So it's not interests themselves. It is how these interests have been weighed, have been assessed, so much so that adequate strategies, methods can be put in place to ensure that these interests are achieved. There are two major types of interest. You have the material interests, which are more tangible, and then you have the ideational interests, which are intangible. Interests like culture, like belief systems, like values, policies, norms that a country wants to achieve, somehow. They want to promote their culture, they want to advance certain values and norms, and would expect other states, to welcome these norms and these beliefs. These are ideational interests. Material interests are interests like migration, interests like, energy resources, control over strategic territory, trade agreements. All of those are more tangible interests. Not necessarily tangible in the sense that you can hold them, but tangible in the sense that they are issues that are more frequent on the foreign policy table as opposed to the ideational interests. All right, now, how do we know what interests are national? How do we identify national interests? National interests include interests like security. How do we ensure the survival and independence of the state? That's national interest. economic welfare, interests of prestige, the status, the position, the image of such a state within the regional and international system, values, promoting values and ideologies. Those are also interests. Some states hold certain values so dear, and those values form a large part of the interests that such states want to achieve or intend to achieve. Expanding control over certain resources or territory, peace and stability. In fact, that is one major interest of almost every state, if not all states, peace and stability, because in the absence of these, then nothing is possible. There's just chaos, and nothing is possible to be achieved in an environment that is not peaceful and stable. So these are some examples of national interests. Interests that assume national dimension, that states will go to any length to pursue and achieve. Foreign policy doctrine and strategies are two different things, but foreign policy, basically, we have said, is a method, is a strategy that is involved in trying to achieve national interest. Okay, now the doctrine of foreign policy is a kind of guide or framework, that gives birth to the strategy with which foreign policy or national interest is pursued. So, for instance, you have an organization. That organization, has certain procedures that they carry out. It could be production procedure, it could be marketing procedure. These are procedures that are carried out by your organization to achieve certain objectives. Those objectives now could be national interest. These procedures that you have could be the strategies that you are carrying out, you're implementing to achieve your interests, your objectives as an organization. But these strategies that are being implemented must be born out of a doctrine, out of some kind of core values that your organization holds dear, some kind of principles, values, that your organization holds dear. These are the values that you would expect that the strategies that you're implementing are built upon. Perhaps values like integrity, values like accountability. So those in this sense would be your doctrine. Those are more of the doctrine. So it is the doctrine, from the example I just gave. Doctrine is what gives birth to the strategies that are implemented in pursuit of foreign policy. So when we talk about foreign policy doctrine, we're talking about the framework, we're talking about the guide, that provides or establishes or gives birth to the strategies that are decided and created in pursuit of national interest. So the strategies themselves are: how do we allocate resources? How much do we allocate to what? Who does what? When do you do it? How is it done? And to what extent is it done? What do you need to do it? Those are strategies. Those are putting things in place. All right? But those strategies must be born out of some kind of doctrine. That's the point you're making. So that's the difference between a foreign policy doctrine and foreign policy or foreign policy strategies. But essentially, foreign policy itself is a method, a means by which a state achieves, the interests that such states, have or hold dear. There are three major tools or instruments for foreign policy. In this presentation, they're called carrot, stick, and sermon, or what is also called diplomacy. We'll be looking at these three methods or tools one after the other. We'll begin with the stick. Stick basically has to do with military force, some kind of force in achieving national interests, And when we talk about force in international relations, we're basically talking about military force, military power, military influence. So sometimes states use military influence, military force to achieve their interests. They use the military power to achieve their interests, and of course, these are most likely states that states that that states that believe, in a realist international system. They will most likely use the military force, to achieve their interest or advance their interest. And what does military force entail? Threat, military aid or assistance, military intelligence, military alliance. All of these are examples of military force, military power that can be used as stick, in terms of foreign policy instruments in achieving national interest. Weapons, weapons development, weapons sharing, and so on and so forth. All right. So of course, both liberals too agree that sometimes force is necessary. Sometimes you need to make some threats. Sometimes you need to use force to achieve national interest. But of course, like we said, force is only used when every diplomatic means, every non-violent means, every other means has failed. That's when a liberal or the liberal economists or that's when force is used from a liberal perspective. So from both the realist and liberal perspective, military force is a tool for foreign policy. But for the liberals, military force is only used when everything else has failed. All right, and of course, stick does not only it's not only restricted to military power. Stick can also include or can also refer to economic sanctions, can refer to trade embargoes, can refer to punitive measures that are established against states for certain kind of violation, or breaking some kind of rule, international rule or agreement that such states have entered into. So stick can be whether military power, they can be economic sanctions, they can be political sanctions, they can be trade-related issues, but stick is whatever is used to move, or forcefully induce an actor to take a decision, or induce an actor or assist an actor to achieve an objective, in a more forceful, assertive manner. That is what the stick is, and I'm sure you understand the idea of stick. Of course, just like you use a literal stick to move something, to hit something, to push something aside, and so on and so forth. So that is what the stick is as a tool for foreign policy. The second tool is carrot. And carrot, like the literal carrot, has to do with giving assistance, rendering help, and so that is what the carrot is about: foreign assistance, foreign aid, in terms or in a bid to achieve national interest. So in terms of in pursuit of national interest, states get into, or states lend a helping hand. States reach out their hands to assist, to render help, to provide aid to other actors. All right. So we're saying that the carrot is pursuit of foreign policy through either multilateral or bilateral, development assistance. And of course, you can see what this development assistance entails: aid for a certain project or program, technical assistance, humanitarian aid, and so on and so forth, military aid, and all those stuff. All right. So it can either be bilateral. Bilateral meaning that it is between just two actors, or it can be multilateral, between more than two actors. So three or more actors make it a multilateral arrangement. Okay, so carrot basically has to do with assistance, and we've talked about what kinds of assistance, development assistance, can be rendered by states in pursuit of their national interest. Remember, we're talking about the tools or instruments for foreign policy. We have said that stick, military aid or military power, economic sanctions, all of those can qualify as stick. Carrot has to do with development assistance essentially. And then the sermon, but before we go to sermon, I would need you to look up, to find out who are the top 10 foreign aid donors, globally. All right. This is just some little activity that you would want to try out. On your own, just find out who are the top 10 foreign aid donors, that there are, in what order, in what rank, and then you can write that down in your notes somewhere. Now, sermons or diplomacy is another tool for foreign policy. And here, this tool is basically used for the additional interest, which we said has to do with culture, values, norms that states want to achieve. All right, they achieve these norms, these values, these cultural interests by diplomacy. By trying to negotiate and dialogue and arrive at certain compromise and agreements with other actors that they are involved in. All right. So, of course, diplomacy includes meetings, negotiations, as the case may be, and the issues that are negotiated on are a range of issues. There are so many issues listed on the screen. There's climate change, terrorism, human rights, environmental issues. All of these issues are issues that are on the negotiation table every now and then. But the question is, can these interests, because these issues can also be interests for certain state actors, can these interests also be achieved using carrot and stick? The answer is yes. So, most times, what tool is used, or the tool that is used, is determined by what interest such an actor is intended to achieve, and what is the priority level of such an interest. So an interest with a very high priority will most likely be pursued at all costs, and sometimes it can involve all three methods being used. An interest that has not so much priority will determine what tool is used, and so on and so forth. So, of course, two types of diplomacy. One type is the public diplomacy, another type is the coercive diplomacy. And public diplomacy has to do with educational support, all the educational tourism too is another public diplomacy, cultural exchange programs, and what have you. All of these are kinds of strategies that states implement in order to pursue their additional interests, promote their culture, promote their values, spread the norms that they believe in, social norms, and other issues of sort. And coercive diplomacy, of course, deals with ultimatum, giving ultimatum to the opponent to either hastily do something or desist from such an action. So these three methods, or these three tools, instruments, are the three major instruments that are used in foreign policy: the carrot, stick, and sermons. All right. And what is the expectation? What does foreign policy? What does this strategy, foreign policy strategy, method? What is expected from foreign policy? Basically, citizens expect to be protected. Projects, or the image of the states is expected to be protected and secure. And there should be world order maintained. There should be a balance in world order. Prosperity should be advanced. Leadership decisions should be made more efficient. and so on and so forth. So all of these are some of the global common good as well should be promoted. These are some of the very important expectations that citizens, individuals, groups, organizations expect from foreign policy implementation. So if foreign policy is properly implemented, these are the outcomes that will result from that. Now, what are the factors that are involved in shaping foreign policy, in shaping what becomes, the policy of a state, the interests of states? What factors shape these policies, the programs, the strategies that states implement? Individuals, help to shape foreign policy. Individuals help to shape foreign policy. Interest groups also help to shape foreign policy. Actors, whether state actors, transnational actors, help to shape foreign policy. The position of a state or an actor within the international scene also helps to shape the strategy and, of course, the objectives that are going to be achieved at the end of the day. All right. Norms, cultures, values, international or the global political culture, as well as the national political culture as well. All of these help to shape foreign policy. All right, in addition to international events. So foreign policy, in terms of strategies that are implemented, as well as the interests, that countries intend to achieve, all of these are shaped by these factors: individuals, civil society groups, interest groups, position, events, and so on and so forth. All right. Now, what are the stages in foreign policy making? How is foreign policy arrived at? What are the various stages in foreign policy? Number one is to articulate what policy, is to be pursued, what interests are to be pursued, articulate them. All right. And how do you articulate? How do you gather? Because, of course, the foreign policy or the national interests that are pursued by states are gathered from such a state, from within the state. And how is it gathered? It's gathered using the media, using interest groups, listening to what the media is saying, listening to what groups are saying, listening to what NGOs are saying, doing some research, interacting with other global actors. All of these are methods by which interests are articulated. All right, foreign policy interests are articulated using these methods. Okay, so interest has to be, the policy itself has to be articulated first. So the point I'm making is that foreign policy making, the first step in foreign policy making is to articulate what policies will be made, what interests are going to be achieved, and then what policies would help achieve those interests at the end of the day. So basically, we want to articulate what is the concern of the people. What do the people want? What is the people's desire? And how do you know what the people's desire are? By listening to the press, by listening to public opinion, by reading, by reading research outcomes, research publications, by listening to NGOs, internal, external actors, and so on and so forth. That's the only way to harvest the interest of the state. And then, of course, because states cannot pursue or achieve, all the interests that there are, there needs to be some kind of prioritizing of interests, and that's what articulation of interests, or that's what articulation does. It helps to identify which ones are more important interests, which ones are more important goals, which ones are not so important, and so on and so forth. All right, so interests must be articulated as the first step. The second step is formulating the policy now, the strategy, right, with which to achieve those interests. And then that's where you have some parastatals. That's where the ministries, departments, agencies come in. The executive arm, of the state come in. The parliaments, make policies, think about the process with which to achieve those interests that have been articulated. Certain bureaucratic organizations, specialists are involved. Sometimes you want policies that will help you achieve some kind of medical outcome. It's important to involve certain medical experts, who have a knowledge of the field and who can provide some specialized technical information in pursuit of those interests that have been articulated. Okay, so these are factors that are necessary in trying to formulate policy. Remember, step 1 is articulating the interests, harvesting interests, prioritizing them. Step 2 is formulating the policies that will help achieve these interests. And we have talked about the people, the groups, specialists who must be involved in formulating these policies. And it's also important to understand that most times policies may be biased, because the people who make them are individuals who have certain interests themselves, who have certain individual interests. So these individual interests, these individual biases can find their way somehow into the policies. And so it's important to be conscious of these biases so that they can be reduced as much as possible. Step 3 is implementing this policy. So the policy is a strategy that has been put in place in order to achieve the interests that have been articulated. This policy needs to be implemented. And of course, that's where you have NGOs, that's where you have local community, you have departments, parastatals, agencies, ministries, of course, are also involved in policy implementation. Funds are needed to implement this policy. And of course, in very many cases, funds that are provided, especially by donor agencies, by state governments, are not used in implementing the policies. And so most times foreign policy dies, and foreign policies are not implemented because the funds are mismanaged, are used carelessly, and most times they're not even accounted for. Corruption, leadership issues, all of these are factors that affect policy implementation, foreign policy implementation. But this is the third stage of foreign policy. So the first stage is articulating the interest. The second stage is formulating the policy. The third stage is implementing the policy. And funds and several other issues of corruption, leadership issues, issues of prioritizing, are issues that help to undermine, and negatively affect policy implementation. The fourth step is evaluation of the policy. Once the policy implementation stage is over, and of course, policy implementation must have a timeline as well, or a duration. Once that duration or that period is over, the policy needs to be evaluated. How well did this policy go? What are the outcomes of this policy? Did it achieve the interest that it set out to achieve? Did it not achieve the interest? What can we do differently next time? But in most cases, this step is mostly overlooked and neglected, which of course is more or less one of the most important steps, or one of the most important step in the foreign policy process. Evaluation is very key because it helps you, to look back at what has happened and how good, how bad was it, and what can be done differently. So evaluation is a very key aspect of foreign policy process, but sometimes it's overlooked, and you need, in most cases, you need think tanks to review, you need research, you need universities, you need institutes, technical institutions to help evaluate and research, and do some kind of analysis of the policy that has been implemented and what exactly were the outcomes of this policy. You also need the media to focus on policy outcome to try and get feedback from the people. How did people perceive the policy that was implemented? What can be done differently to improve this policy, and so on and so forth. So the 4 aspects or the 4 steps in the foreign policy process are articulation of the interests, formulation of the policy, implementation of the policy, and then policy evaluation. It's important to understand these 4 steps in the foreign policy process. Now, foreign policy style and tradition. These are 2 other concepts that are unique in foreign policy discussion or discussion around foreign policy. Foreign policy style is simply a method of reaction, that a state has to issues, or to the policy. What kind of policies, what kind of policy do states implement, or do states pursue in the international system? What is the mode, the nature of the policies that states pursue? And there are 4 various styles, so there are 4 different styles of foreign policy that are listed there. You have the acquiescent style, you have the preservative style, you have the promotive style, and then the intransigent style. All right. So these are the 4 styles of foreign policy that exist, and we're saying that in very many cases, states subscribe to one of these styles. So you can have a state that constantly practices the promotive foreign policy style. That's because such a state always seeks to promote its status in the international system, and so all the foreign policies, that it implements assumes this promotive style, just trying to assert its status, trying to assert its influence, trying to maintain a particular status, a position in the international system. That could be a foreign policy style of a state. A state could have an acquiescent style, meaning that it is always aligning its foreign policy with those of other more powerful states. And of course, this is an equivalent with bandwagoning that we talked about, in the realist theory. So a state might want to align its foreign policy with those of bigger, more powerful states. That could be the style of foreign policy of a particular state. Over time, they just want to align their foreign policy for reasons, of course, that are peculiar to such a state. So any of these 4 can be one of the styles, can be one of the nature, the kind of foreign policy behavior that states always want to express or exhibit. That is what foreign policy style means. Now, a foreign policy tradition is a style that has existed for a very long time. So if a particular state has practiced the preservative foreign policy style for 20, 30 years, 2, 3 decades, 4 decades, they have always practiced the preservative foreign policy style. It means that the preservative foreign policy style has become a tradition for such a state. It has become a foreign policy tradition. The preservative style has become a foreign policy tradition for such a state. I hope I'm making sense. So we're trying to differentiate between foreign policy style and the foreign policy tradition. And we're saying that a tradition is a style that have been implemented for a long time, or that has lasted for a very long time, over a period of time. Okay, so these 4 styles can be implemented, and of course, when a particular style is implemented over a long period of time, it becomes a tradition. So 4 concepts that we have understood in this foreign policy discussion are foreign policy doctrine, which we said is the framework that gives birth to the strategy. There's foreign policy strategy as well, which of course has to do with the allocation of resources, determining how and how not the policy is to be achieved, the interest is to be achieved. All right, and then we have come now to foreign policy style and then foreign policy tradition. These are 4 important concepts that you must take away from this discussion on foreign policy and national interest. Now, in conclusion, we have talked about the fact that foreign policy, national interest are very, very linked. Even though the line between them can be very thin. In most cases, some people refer to national and foreign policy as national interest because, of course, it's policy. It's policy, so it's referred to as national interest. But essentially, national interests are goals, objectives, that particular outcomes that states want to see, that actors want to experience. Those are interests. But policies are the method, the ways by which states go about bringing about such an outcome, such an objective, achieving such an objective. All right, we've talked about these four issues of doctrine, strategy, style, tradition. And we have also looked at the various tools of foreign policy, the carrot, the stick, and the sermon, which of course are used sometimes depending on the priority of the interest. All 3 can be used together in some cases. 2 can be used together. Just 1 can be used depending on how important such an interest is. And of course, I want to leave you with these 2 questions. What is the foreign policy analysis process? Of course, we've talked about the foreign policy process, so that's a typographical error. What is the process of foreign policy analysis? How do you analyze policy? What are the levels of analysis? All right, that's the second question. What are the various levels of analyzing foreign policy? Okay, so you want to find out what is the process of foreign policy, which we've talked about. So you might just want to go refresh your memory about the process of foreign policy. We said that there are four foreign policy processes or foreign policy steps. And then, of course, you also want to find out what are the various levels of analysis. We've talked about levels of analysis in certain other previous conversations. So you want to find out what are the levels of analysis and what is foreign policy, what is the foreign policy process as well. All right. So this is where we're going to draw the curtain on today's presentation. I hope that this has been insightful and that you have understood, what this conversation is about, national interest, foreign policy. And I hope you find some time to, do some homework, find the answers to some of the questions that have been asked, what the foreign policy process is. We have talked about that. And then what are the levels of analysis, of foreign policy analysis? We've talked about the levels of analysis in international relations. And so you want to refresh your mind about that as well. All right. And somewhere along the line in the presentation, we talked about you finding out the top 10 aid donors, all right, in the international system. Okay, so these are just some things to keep you working and keep this conversation fresh in your minds. If you have questions, if you have concerns or other comments, we can continue the conversation, of course, via my contact details. Thank you so much for listening.